In the 1830s, on a coral island 2 miles wide and 4 miles long, sitting 90 miles from Cuba and 128 miles from the nearest Florida town of any size, the per capita income was higher than anywhere else in the United States, higher than New York, higher than Boston, higher than Philadelphia. And the source of all that money was other people's catastrophe. The citizens of Key West got rich because ships kept wrecking on the reef. That fact, a tiny island floating at the bottom of the continent, building a fortune on disaster, is the first thing you need to understand about Key West. Because every chapter of this city's story follows the same pattern. Something saves Key West. That thing makes the island prosperous. And then that same thing, the wrecking, the cigars, the railroad, the tourists, slowly becomes the force that hollows it out from the inside. The houses the wreckers built are still standing. Many of them have a peculiar architectural feature, a small windowed platform perched on the roof, sometimes called a cupola, sometimes a widow's walk. In most coastal towns, a widow's walk was where a sea captain's wife stood to watch for her husband's returning ship. In Key West, it served a different purpose entirely. The wrecking master climbed up to the cupola before dawn and scanned the horizon with a spyglass, searching for ships in distress on the reef. The first man to reach a wreck became the wrecking master for that salvage. He controlled the operation and took the largest share of the prize. So those rooftop perches weren't sentimental. They were business infrastructure. The higher your house, the earlier you spotted the wreck, the richer you got. The island had been more or less uninhabited for centuries. The Spanish called it Cayo Hueso, Island of Bones, because early visitors found human remains scattered across the beaches, likely the remnants of wars between the Calusa people and their enemies, who chased them down the chain of keys until there was nowhere left to run. When the United States acquired Florida from Spain in 1819, a Spanish artillery officer named Juan Pablo Salas still held a land grant to the island. In 1822, an American businessman named John Simonton bought the entire island from Salas for $2,000. Simonton subdivided it and sold 3 undivided quarters to 3 partners, John Whitehead, John Fleming, and John Mountain, each of whom has a Key West street named after him today. Only one of the 4 founding buyers, Pardon C. Green, who purchased Mountain's share, ever actually lived there. What drew these men was not the land itself, which was scrubby coral rock with almost no fresh water. It was the harbor, deep, sheltered, and positioned at the choke point where every merchant vessel sailing between the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic had to pass through the Straits of Florida. The Gulf Stream pushed those ships close to the reef, and the reef was merciless. More than 100 vessels a day passed Key West. At least one a week hit the coral. By the late 1820s, Congress had passed a law requiring all wrecks in American waters to be adjudicated through American courts, which meant the salvage auctions had to happen in Key West, not Nassau. That single piece of legislation transformed a fishing village into a boom town overnight. Bahamian wreckers relocated permanently. New England fishermen retooled their boats. Warehouses went up along the waterfront, and the goods that passed through them read like a catalog of the 19th century world. Chinese silk, English porcelain, Cuban rum, Georgia cotton, Mexican silver, French lace, mahogany furniture. The larger salvage, bales of cotton, stacks of lumber, was auctioned on the piers in the open air, with buyers coming from as far as New York. The smaller and more valuable things, spices, ivory, bolts of silk, cases of silver, were carried into warehouses for private sale. In 1846, a single year's worth of salvage was valued at $1.6 million, the equivalent of roughly $50 million today. In 1856, 2,000 residents split nearly $400,000 in a single year of particularly productive wrecking, the equivalent of roughly $7 million, for a town that could fit inside a few city blocks. The money showed. William Curry, who arrived as a penniless Bahamian teenager and became the wrecking industry's greatest operator, built a fortune that made him the first millionaire in the state of Florida. Asa Tift, another wrecker, built a grand house with columns and an enormous cistern, later sold to a family that rented it to a young writer named Ernest Hemingway. The houses going up along Whitehead Street and Caroline Street featured pine shipped from the Florida mainland, and their construction often used shipbuilding techniques because the men who built them were sailors first and homeowners second. From their rooftop cupolas, they could see 60 miles on a clear day, and they kept watching. Then the government started building lighthouses. It was inevitable, of course. The same federal authority that had given Key West its wrecking monopoly decided that too many ships were dying on the reef. The lighthouse at Sand Key went up in 1853. Others followed. Sombrero Key, Carey's Fort Reef, Alligator Reef, until by the 1860s, a chain of blinking lights warned navigators off the very coral that had made Key West the wealthiest small city in America. Fewer wrecks meant fewer auctions. The salvage revenue didn't vanish all at once. It ebbed over 2 decades, the way a tide goes out slowly enough that you don't notice the rocks appearing until you're standing on dry ground. But Key West did not collapse. It found another fortune, and this one came from Cuba. In the 1860s, Cuba was convulsing with revolution against Spain. Thousands of Cubans fled across the strait, 90 miles of open water, and landed on Key West. Many of them were cigar makers. In 1831, an American named William H. Wall had opened a small cigar factory employing about 50 rollers, importing raw tobacco from Havana. But the real explosion came when the Cuban refugees arrived with generations of skill in their hands. By 1867, a German immigrant named Samuel Seidenberg had established a factory making clear Cuban cigars. Cuban tobacco rolled by Cuban workers on American soil. It was a brilliant business model, authentic Havana quality without the import tariff. Vicente Martinez Ybor opened his factory El Príncipe de Gales, and the E.H. Gatto Company followed, and the Cortez Cigar Company, and dozens more. By 1885, there were 86 cigar factories on the island, and 20 of them employed more than 100 workers each, with Gatto's leading at 500. By 1890, the number of factories had grown to nearly 130, and the annual output approached 100 million cigars. In the 1880s, 1/3 of Key West's residents were Cuban. The phrase Key West cigar became shorthand for the finest smoke money could buy. The city had replaced one form of found treasure, wrecked cargo, with another, rolled tobacco. The cigar workers lived well. Their unions were powerful. While factory workers in northern cities huddled in tenement housing, Key West cigar workers walked to their benches beneath royal poinciana trees, past night-blooming jasmine, in a city perfumed by frangipani and cured tobacco leaf. Their strike demands give you a sense of their expectations. In 1918, they walked off the job until management agreed to stop sweeping the factory floor before 6 in the morning, to put ice in the drinking water, and to heat the building with coal instead of wood in winter. These were not men fighting for survival. These were men who had arrived at a quality of life worth protecting. And then on the night of March 30th, 1886, someone lit a fire next to the San Carlos Institute on Duval Street. The San Carlos was the beating heart of Cuban culture in Key West, a meeting hall, a political club, the place where Cuban revolutionaries plotted the overthrow of Spanish colonial rule. The cigar workers in Key West were sending a large portion of their wages back to Cuba to fund the revolution, a fact that did not escape Spain's attention. Whether the fire was set by Spanish agents has never been definitively proved, but the circumstantial evidence is striking. Havana newspapers reportedly ran a story about a great fire in Key West the day before the fire occurred, and the morning after the blaze, a Spanish ship sat waiting in the harbor to carry any unemployed Cuban workers back to Havana. 400 of them boarded. The fire burned for 12 hours. The city's only steam fire engine had been sent to New York for repairs, another suspiciously convenient absence. and firefighters were left with hand pumpers and cistern water. The flames consumed 50 acres, 40% of the entire city, including 80% of the commercial district. 18 major cigar factories burned. 614 houses and buildings were destroyed. City Hall and most municipal records were incinerated. 7 people died. The property damage reached $2 million, north of $60 million in today's money, and only $50,000 of it was covered by insurance. After the fire, Key West passed an ordinance requiring metal roofs on all new construction, a rule that shaped the look of the city permanently. Walk through Old Town today, and nearly every building gleams with corrugated tin. That's not charm, that's scar tissue. The fire didn't kill the cigar industry, but it wounded it badly enough that the bleeding never quite stopped. Vincente Martinez Ybor, his factory reduced to ash, looked around and made a calculation. He bought 40 acres of scrubland near Tampa for $4,000 and moved his operation north. Tampa had what Key West could never offer, a railroad connection to the rest of the country, cheap land for expansion, and a workforce that hadn't yet organized. Other manufacturers followed. By 1900, only 44 cigar factories remained in Key West. The area around Ybor's new Tampa factory became Ybor City, and within a decade, Tampa had 150 cigar factories employing more than 10,000 workers. The industry that Key West had incubated, the industry built by Cuban refugees on an island where the tobacco arrived by boat, simply picked up and moved to a place with a train. Key West still had sponges, at least for a while. The shallow waters around the Keys held rich beds of natural sponge, and by 1890, the island held a monopoly on the American sponge trade. 1,200 men working 350 hook boats, pulling 2,000 tons of sponge a year, worth $750,000. But the same story played out again. Greek immigrants arrived in Florida around 1904, equipped with hard-hat diving suits and lead boots that let them harvest sponge from deeper water the hook boats couldn't reach. The conchs, the native Key West residents, descendants of Bahamians and New Englanders, resented the Greeks furiously. In 1914, armed men boarded a Greek sponge schooner called the Amelia in Key West Harbor, forced the crew off at gunpoint, robbed the ship, and dynamited it. A Greek crewman named John Manus was still aboard when the charge went off. He did not survive. It didn't matter. The sponge trade drifted north to Tarpon Springs, and a blight in the 1940s finished what remained of Key West's sponge beds. Another industry gone. By the early 20th century, Key West had burned through wrecking, cigars, and sponges. The island's population had reached roughly 18,000 by 1890, which made it, and this fact still startles people, the largest city in the state of Florida, a distinction it held until after the turn of the century. Miami, 160 miles to the north, had about 500 people. Key West was Florida's first real city, the first to have a significant population, the first to have industry, the first to have wealth. Everything else, Miami, Tampa, Jacksonville as a metropolis, came later. And then one of the richest men in America decided to build a railroad across the open ocean to reach it. Henry Flagler had co-founded Standard Oil alongside John D. Rockefeller and poured his fortune into developing Florida's East Coast, the railroad, the hotels, West Palm Beach, Miami. In 1905, with the Panama Canal under construction, Flagler decided that Key West, the closest American deepwater port to the canal, needed a rail connection. Engineers told him it couldn't be done. Building over 100 miles of track across open water, mangrove swamp, and coral islands was, in the professional opinion of most people who studied it, impossible. Flagler didn't agree. "It is perfectly simple," he said. "All you have to do is build one concrete arch and then another, and pretty soon you will find yourself in Key West." It took 7 years. At peak construction, 4,000 men were working simultaneously. 5 hurricanes struck during the building. The engineering challenges were staggering. The 7-mile bridge alone, connecting Marathon with Big Pine Key, required innovations in concrete construction that had never been attempted. The total cost was somewhere around $50 million, which translates to roughly $1.25 billion today. The press called it Flagler's Folly. On January 22, 1912, the inaugural train pulled into the Key West terminal at Trumbo Point. Flagler rode in his private rail car. He was 82 years old, frail, nearly blind. School children, dignitaries, and the city's mayor, J.N. Fogarty, were waiting to cheer. "I can hear the children," Flagler said, tears running down his face, "but I cannot see them." He said simply that now he could die in peace. He did, 16 months later. The railroad was called the eighth wonder of the world, but freight traffic on the single-track extension was disappointing. The surge of Panama Canal cargo Flagler had predicted never materialized through Key West. Passenger service ran, but the island didn't grow the way Flagler had envisioned. He had predicted 50,000 residents by 1920. The census that year counted 18,749. Flagler had, however, kept one more promise. He commissioned a grand hotel, the Casa Marina, designed by Thomas Hastings and John Carrere, the architects of the New York Public Library. It opened on New Year's Eve, 1920, with Florida pine hardwood interiors, grand archways, and a private beach. 3 days later, President Warren G. Harding checked in. The Casa Marina would survive everything that was about to happen next, but the railroad would not. On Labor Day, September 2nd, 1935, a Category 5 hurricane, the strongest ever to make landfall in the United States to that date, crossed the upper Florida Keys with sustained winds of 185 miles per hour and gusts reaching 200. The barometric pressure dropped to 892 millibars, a record that still stands in the Western Hemisphere for an Atlantic landfall. The storm surge swept 18 to 20 feet of water across the islands, scouring some of them down to bare coral. In the path of the storm were 3 camps of World War I veterans, men from the old Bonus Army, who had been sent to the Keys by the Federal Emergency Relief Administration to build the overseas highway. The camps were flimsy wooden structures. When Key West officials requested an evacuation train from Miami, it left at 4:25 in the afternoon. By the time it reached Upper Matecumbe Key, the storm surge knocked it off the tracks. More than 400 people died. Bodies were recovered as far away as Cape Sable on the southwestern tip of the Florida mainland. In the subtropical heat, the dead swelled and split open within days. Public health officials ordered them stacked in makeshift coffins and cremated on the banks of Snake Creek. Hemingway, who had participated in the rescue effort from Key West, wrote a furious article for a national magazine. "Who sent them down to the Florida Keys and left them there in hurricane months?" he demanded. "Who is responsible for their deaths?" Nobody answered. 40 miles of Flagler's railroad were destroyed. Tracks were shifted bodily off their roadbeds. Bridges that had withstood 5 hurricanes during construction were torn from their pilings. The Florida East Coast Railway, already weakened by the Depression, could not afford to rebuild. The eighth wonder of the world had lasted 23 years. The company sold the right-of-way to the state of Florida for $640,000, barely more than 1% of what Flagler had spent to build it. The hurricane was devastating, but Key West had already been dying before the storm arrived. The cigar factories were gone. The sponge industry was gone. The Navy base had been reduced to a skeleton crew. The Great Depression had hit the island harder than almost anywhere else in the country because there was simply nothing left to sustain an economy. By 1934, 80% of Key West's 11,600 citizens were on relief. The city government had defaulted on millions in bonded debt. It could no longer pay for fire, police, or sanitation services. City employees were paid in scrip, paper IOUs that merchants reluctantly accepted and used to pay their own taxes. Instead of selling apples on street corners the way the unemployed did on the mainland, Key West men peddled coconuts or tried to catch sharks for $1.50 a carcass. Children dove off the Mallory docks for pennies tossed by the handful of tourists who still wandered in. On July 2nd, 1934, the city did something that no other American city has done before or since. The City Council formally surrendered its powers of government to the state of Florida. The headlines ran nationally. An American city, the same city that had been the wealthiest per capita in the nation less than a century before, was declaring itself incapable of self-governance. The governor, David Schultz, declared a state of civil emergency and turned the entire island over to the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. A man named Julius Stone, Jr., an organic chemist with a Harvard doctorate, the son of the president of Ohio State University's Research Foundation, a man who had built and then lost a personal fortune in the 1929 crash, was given what amounted to dictatorial control over a city of 12,000 people. Newspapers at the time described Key West's situation as more acute and oppressive than any other municipality in the country. The city was, in the language of business, being restructured like a corporation in receivership. Stone faced three options. He could pump in $2.5 million of federal relief money, which would keep people fed but solve nothing. He could relocate 3,000 families to the mainland and effectively abandon the island. Or he could try something that had never been attempted, turn a bankrupt, destitute, isolated city into a tourist resort. He chose the third option, and in doing so, he invented the Key West that exists today. Stone organized 4,000 residents into a volunteer corps. They swept garbage from the streets, demolished outhouses, cleared weedy beaches, planted landscaping along the main roads. 200 homes were renovated so that rooms could be rented to visitors, with the Key West administration paying for repairs and collecting rent until the costs were recouped, then turning the income over to the homeowners. The Casa Marina was reopened under a government financial guarantee. Artists from the WTA's Federal Art Project were sent down to paint the island. Adrian Dornbush, Stanley Wood, Avery Johnson. And their work was reproduced as tourist brochures and postcards mailed to every corner of the country, advertising America's only Caribbean city. Stone also grasped something critical. The old highway, a patchwork of roads and ferries that had partially opened in 1928, was not good enough. You couldn't build a tourist economy if people couldn't easily drive to you. In 1937, the Public Works Commission approved a $3.6 million loan to convert Flagler's surviving railroad bridges into automobile bridges. On March 29, 1938, the Overseas Highway opened to continuous traffic, built quite literally on the bones of the railroad. You drove to Key West on concrete arches that Henry Flagler had poured for locomotives. The toll was $1 per car, plus a quarter for each passenger. It worked faster than anyone expected. Farah developed a map identifying 48 tourist attractions on the island, a designation that infuriated Hemingway, who found himself listed as one of them. By 1935, before the highway was even finished, 40,000 tourists had visited Key West, and hotel reservations were up 85%. Stone, who had told the local newspaper that, with a scratch of my pen, I started this work in Key West, and with a scratch of my pen, I can stop it, eventually settled on the island and practiced law there until his death in 1967. He had turned the city's bankruptcy into its founding myth as a vacation destination. The war years brought another surge. The Navy expanded massively in Key West. During World War II, German U-boats were sinking cargo ships in the Gulf Stream practically within sight of the island, and the military turned the city into a base for submarine chasers, blimps, and seaplanes. Thomas Edison had lived at the Naval Commandant's quarters for 6 months in 1918, working on weapons technology. Now, the same base was hunting U-boats. The military population swelled the city, and Key West's census numbers, which had been stagnant for decades, jumped. The population hit roughly 26,000 by 1950, then peaked at about 34,000 in 1960, the highest it has ever been. When the Cold War began, the strategic importance of a base 90 miles from Cuba kept the Navy engaged. President Harry Truman visited 11 times between 1946 and 1952, working out of the former naval commandant's quarters that became known as the Little White House. He swam, played poker, wore Hawaiian shirts on the porch, and made enough executive decisions from that house that it became functionally the winter seat of American government. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, the Army commandeered the Casa Marina, Flagler's Grand Hotel, the one with the New York Public Library architects, and used it as headquarters for a Hawk missile battery. Soldiers set up 4 launchers on the private beach where President Harding had once strolled. The missiles pointed south, toward Havana. Meanwhile, the waterfront had found one more industry: shrimp. In the 1950s, Key West became the center of a pink shrimp fishery that brought nearly 500 trawlers into port at a time. The docks along the historic seaport, which had once handled wrecking salvage, then sponges, then cigar factory supplies, now reeked of brine and diesel fuel. The shrimpers were rough men, and they spent their money in the bars, and the bars were better for it. But the shrimping, too, would fade. Overfishing, regulation, and cheaper imports from Asia gutted the fleet by the 1980s, leaving the docks available for the next occupant: charter fishing boats and sunset cruise catamarans. Through all of this, the tourist economy kept growing. And it kept growing because Key West had one thing no amount of planning could manufacture. It was genuinely strange. It was the end of the road, literally the last mile marker on U.S. Route 1, the highway that starts at the Canadian border in Maine and terminates at the corner of Whitehead and Fleming Streets. Hemingway had lived there from 1931 to 1939, writing some of his most celebrated work in the second-floor study of the Asa Tift House, surrounded by the polydactyl cats whose descendants still wander the property. Tennessee Williams came. Elizabeth Bishop came. Robert Frost came and wintered there for years. The artists who arrived in the 1930s as WPA workers stayed and painted, and their paintings drew other artists, and the artists attracted the kind of people who like to drink with artists, and the bars on Duval Street, Sloppy Joe's, Captain Tony's, the Green Parrot, became genuinely legendary, not as tourist traps, but as places where actual writers and fishermen and dropouts sat elbow to elbow because the island was small enough that everyone went to the same 3 bars. Key West developed a tolerance, even a fondness for eccentricity. It became one of the first openly welcoming places in America for gay men and women at a time when most of the country was violently hostile. The live and let live attitude wasn't a marketing strategy. It was a survival mechanism on a 2-by-4-mile island where you couldn't avoid your neighbors. You either got along with everybody or you left. Most people got along. In April 1982, the federal government set up a Border Patrol checkpoint on US 1 near Florida City, searching every car leaving the Keys for drugs and illegal immigrants. A 17-mile traffic jam formed instantly. Tourism reservations cratered. The Key West City Council took a federal judge to court, lost, and then Mayor Dennis Wardlow did something perfectly in character for a place that had always survived by turning catastrophe into theater. On April 23rd, he stood on a flatbed truck, declared that Key West was seceding from the United States, named the new nation the Conch Republic, broke a loaf of stale Cuban bread over the head of a man in a Navy uniform, and surrendered to the federal government 1 minute later, demanding $1 billion in foreign aid. The Coast Guard cutter Diligence was pelted with conch fritters. The roadblock was quietly removed. The Conch Republic became a tourism brand that endures to this day, complete with passports, flags, and an annual independence celebration. It was a joke that also happened to be deadly serious. But somewhere between the Conch Republic and the present, something shifted. The strangeness that had made Key West magnetic started to calcify into product. Duval Street, which had once held cigar factories and sponge warehouses, and the San Carlos Institute where revolutionaries plotted, and a fire may have been set by Spanish spies, Duval Street filled with T-shirt shops and frozen drink chains and stores selling nothing but hot sauce. The E.H. Gatto Cigar Factory building, where 500 rollers once turned out millions of cigars a year, now houses Monroe County government offices on Simonton Street. A few blocks away, a small, family-owned cigar shop on Fitzpatrick Street still rolls cigars by hand. It is the oldest cigar company in the Keys, started in Cuba in 1947. But it exists as a curiosity, not an industry. The bars that had been interesting because interesting people went to them became interesting only because tourists had been told they were interesting. Sloppy Joe's became a brand. Captain Tony's became a photo opportunity. Every evening at Mallory Square, where sponge auctions once drew buyers from across the country, tourists now gather for the sunset celebration. Street performers, craft vendors, a crowd that claps when the sun hits the water, then disperses to dinner. Hemingway's house became a $12 admission fee and a gift shop selling six-toed cat merchandise. The cruise ships arrived in force in the 1990s and 2000s, and they changed the math of the island entirely. Before the pandemic, on a busy day, 2 or 3 ships would dock and disgorge as many as 10,000 passengers onto an island where only 25,000 people actually lived. The passengers walked Duval Street for 4 hours, bought a T-shirt, ate an ice cream cone, took a photo at the southernmost point buoy, and walked back to the ship for the dinner they'd already paid for. They spent almost nothing in restaurants. They didn't stay in hotels. They didn't rent bicycles or book fishing charters or eat at the Cuban places on the side streets. They were a river of human traffic that flowed through the city and left behind nothing but congestion, exhaust, and churned-up harbor water. Residents watched it happen. The harbor, they said, was visibly dirtier when the ships were in port. The streets became impassable. The coral reef, the same reef that had wrecked the ships that built Key West's first fortune, was being damaged by the prop wash of vessels weighing 100,000 tons. Then COVID shut down the cruise industry entirely, and something remarkable happened. The water in Key West Harbor turned clear. The streets emptied. The overnight visitors, the ones who stayed in hotels, ate in restaurants, rented boats, tipped bartenders, had the island largely to themselves. For the first time in decades, Key West felt like the place the old-timers remembered. In November 2020, residents voted on 3 referendums. They limited cruise ship disembarkation to 1,500 passengers per day. They banned ships with a capacity of 1,300 or more from stopping at all. They gave docking priority to cruise lines with the best environmental records. 2 of the 3 measures passed with more than 60% of the vote. The third passed with more than 80%. It was a democratic act of self-preservation, and it was overturned almost immediately. The Florida State Legislature, lobbied by cruise industry interests, passed a law preempting local authority over cruise ship traffic. The referendums that Key West voters had passed were effectively nullified. The Norwegian Dawn, a 965-foot ship carrying over 3,000 people, docked at the privately owned Pier B in 2021. 200 protesters gathered at Mallory Pier with signs. A flotilla of 20 boats flew safer, cleaner ships flags in the harbor. The passengers walked past the protesters on their way to Duval Street. Today, Key West operates in a strange equilibrium. The city limits cruise disembarkation at the public pier, but the private pier still accepts large ships. 1 ship per day is typical now instead of 2 or 3. But cruise traffic is only one layer of the pressure. Key West International Airport handled more than 1 million passengers in the first 8 months of 2025 alone, a 10% increase over the same period in 2023. Vacation rentals, Airbnbs charging an average of $400 a night, have consumed the housing stock. The median home price has surged past $1.1 million, representing a 300 to 400% increase since 2000. The median household income is around $87,000, but individual earnings for the workers who actually keep the tourist economy running, bartenders, hotel cleaners, restaurant cooks, fishing boat deckhands, are far lower. A worker needs to earn $33 an hour just to afford the median rent. Most tourism jobs don't pay close to that. The result is an island where the people who serve the drinks and change the sheets and guide the snorkeling trips cannot afford to live. Many commute from Stock Island, just across the bridge, where rents are slightly less punishing. Others drive in from Marathon, 50 miles up US 1, a daily round trip of 100 miles along a two-lane highway where a single fender bender can turn the commute into 3 hours. In a 2024 property appraisal, out of roughly 8,800 residential properties in Key West eligible for homestead exemption, only about 3,500 were actually homesteaded, meaning occupied by permanent residents. The rest were second homes, investment properties, or vacation rentals. A city of 25,000 residents sits inside a real estate portfolio of 10,000 houses, and most of those houses are owned by people who aren't there. Visitors to the Florida Keys now spend about $3.5 billion a year. Tourism supports more than 24,000 jobs in Monroe County. The visitor economy is said to save local households $11,500 per year in reduced property taxes. By every financial measure, the tourism industry is working exactly as designed. The question is what it is working for. Key West has been the wealthiest small city in America and the most bankrupt. It has been an island of wreckers, of cigar rollers, of sponge fishermen, of railroad workers, of Navy sailors, of writers, of outcasts, of artists, and finally, comprehensively, of tourists. Each identity replaced the one before it, and each replacement seemed at the time like salvation. The lighthouses that killed wrecking were supposed to save sailors. The fire that scattered the cigar makers was supposed to break a revolution. The railroad that connected Key West to the world cost $50 million and lasted 23 years before a hurricane ripped it apart and the state bought the wreckage for $640,000. The highway built on that wreckage brought the cars that brought the tourists, that brought the cruise ships, that the residents voted to ban, only to be overruled by a legislature 200 miles away. The old wreckers' cupolas are still up on the rooftops in Old Town. They're in the real estate listings now. Historic Widow's Walk, the agents call them. Panoramic ocean views. The houses beneath them sell for $1 million, $1.5 million, $2 million to buyers from New York and Chicago and Los Angeles who visit for a week in January and leave the shutters closed the rest of the year. A tourist might walk down Whitehead Street, look up at one of those cupolas, and think it's quaint, decorative, a little piece of old Florida. It was built so a man could see a ship dying on the reef in time to beat his neighbor to the wreckage.